At 7:15 in the morning on a cold, rainy Tuesday, they handed me a pink slip. By 11:30, I had frozen their $450 million cargo empire solid. 15 years of absolute dedication, of sleeping in truck stops and eating diesel fumes, had just been reduced to a security guard escorting me out of the building. The name on the paper was Walter Vance Ramirez, but to the drivers and the dispatchers who actually made the wheels turn, I was just Vance. I am 60 years old, and for 3 decades, I have been the quiet gear keeping Ashford Transport from falling apart. If you bought fresh produce in the city of Chicago, building materials in Wisconsin, or heavy tractors in Iowa, you probably had me to thank for it. I was the coordinator who ran logistics for a $450 million shipping network, managing 1,200 commercial vehicles across 6 states. The company was founded by Donald Ashford, a tough old veteran who knew that freight is not moved by spreadsheets, but by the trust between drivers and dispatchers. We had an unspoken agreement. I kept the drivers happy and the freight flowing, and he stayed out of my way. Before this disaster happened, I had spent 8 years running supply convoys in the Army, including 2 deployments in hostile territory, and I knew how to handle a crisis. I survived recessions and a cyber attack that had me routing trucks with paper maps and payphone calls. I had a desk that smelled like engine oil and black coffee, buried in the operational heart of the building where the real work happens. The constant hum of radios let me hear the pulse of the road. But everything changed when Donald retired to a golf course in Scottsdale, leaving the reins of the empire to his 42-year-old son, Brandon. Brandon Ashford had spent his life in expensive schools, obtaining a Master of Business Administration degree that apparently taught him how to look important in a tailored suit, but nothing about actual logistics. He arrived in a luxury sedan with radioactive white teeth and immediately started talking about disrupting the antiquated trucking industry. Within his first month, he hired Chloe Bennett, a corporate consultant who called herself the Chief Culture Officer, which was really just a fancy title for his girlfriend who needed a high-paying job. Together, they began implementing policies that made no sense to anyone who actually did the work. Brandon wanted to phase out our traditional communication channels in favor of messaging software, and Chloe started scheduling mandatory team-building exercises. I ignored the noise and kept my head down, focusing on routing our drivers safely. The friction between us grew slowly, like a slow oil leak in a hydraulic cylinder. Brandon did not like me because I was a relic of his father's era, a man who preferred boots and a radio over spreadsheets and digital dashboard charts. To Brandon, I was obsolete. The breaking point arrived during the peak of the autumn harvest, our busiest season of the entire year. We had 25 critical agricultural shipments of grain scheduled to move on a Saturday afternoon for local farmers, whose entire livelihood depended on getting their crops to the terminal. Before the heavy winter storms hit, that was when Brandon sent a company-wide email about a mandatory weekend retreat at a lakeside resort. I knew my drivers could not afford a delay, so I wrote a short email to Brandon, explaining that I could not attend the retreat due to the urgent shipments. I told him that I needed to remain at my desk to monitor the grain convoys and protect the retirement funds of our drivers. I thought he would understand that business came first, but I was wrong. When I walked into the terminal on Monday morning, the office felt unusually quiet. The constant chatter of the radio was silent, and the dispatchers were avoiding my eyes. When I tried to log into the terminal system, my credentials were rejected. The computer screen displayed a message stating that my access was denied. Before I could pick up the telephone to call technical support, I heard Brandon's expensive shoes clicking behind me. He was standing there with Chloe, who was holding a tablet, and 2 security guards from the private security firm. Brandon informed me that the company was undergoing a restructuring for efficiency and that my refusal to attend the retreat showed that I was not aligned with their corporate culture. Chloe smiled and added some meaningless corporate jargon about matching the frequency of the new organization. I stood up from my desk, looked at Brandon, and told him that he was making a massive mistake. I pointed out that I personally managed the safety protocols and vendor relationships for our entire logistics network, and that these agreements did not simply run themselves. Brandon laughed and told me that everyone was replaceable. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my badge, and dropped it onto the desk in front of him. I told him that his first major convoy would reach the scale house in a few hours, and that he would soon realize what happens when the heart of the operation is ripped out. I grabbed the framed photograph of my son, Toby Ramirez, who was studying welding at a local trade school, and walked out into the rain. I walked out into the downpour and climbed into my heavy truck, letting the engine idle while I collected my thoughts. The defroster hummed as the windshield slowly cleared, reflecting the gray industrial sky of Chicago. I was not panicking, though I was a single father with a son in trade school, whose tuition was not cheap. I had spent 8 years running supply convoys in the Army, and I knew how to stay calm when everything around me was falling apart. The Army teaches you that a plan is only as good as the relationships holding it together, and I had spent 30 years building those relationships in the civilian world. I pulled out my personal cell phone, the one I had kept separate from my corporate account, and began contacting the key leaders of our logistics network. These were not the formal contacts listed in the company directory. They were the private, direct phone numbers of terminal managers, port operators, and dispatch chiefs who actually made sure the containers moved. I did not send a mass email or make a loud public scene. Instead, I worked my way down my personal list alphabetically, making individual calls. I informed them that as of 7:15 that morning, I was no longer employed by Ashford Transport and was no longer authorized to sign safety clearances, negotiate emergency rates, or certify equipment compliance. I specifically reminded each of them of Clause 7B in our carrier contracts, a safety clause I had personally inserted years ago when the company was expanding. Under Clause 7B, any change in key logistics personnel triggered an immediate safety and credit review, allowing our partners to suspend operations until they could audit the credentials of the new management team. Within minutes, my phone began ringing. The first call was from Bruce Gallagher, the head of Teamsters Local 120. Bruce asked me what was happening, and I explained that Brandon had let me go because of a culture fit issue. Bruce let out a loud laugh, stating that if I was not there to verify the safety protocols, his drivers would not move a single yard. He told me he was issuing a message to all 120 drivers, telling them to park their rigs at the nearest safe exit, because they would not risk their commercial driver's licenses for Brandon. The next domino fell at the Chicago Port Authority, where the terminal operators refused to accept our incoming containers without my signed authorization. By 11:30 in the morning, the entire logistics network began grinding to a halt. I drove to Rusty's truck stop off the interstate, ordered a cup of black coffee, and opened my personal laptop to monitor the system. The diner smelled of bacon grease and stale coffee, a familiar sanctuary where I had spent many late nights. Brenda, the waitress, kept my cup filled while I watched the red dots appear on my screen. Using a public tracking application, I watched as red dots began appearing across the map. Each red dot represented a stationary commercial vehicle that had been parked by its driver. There was a massive cluster of red dots forming near the Chicago grain terminal because the security codes to the automated loading gates changed weekly, and the manual override required my digital authentication token. Brandon had assumed the gates opened automatically, but they were now locked tight. At 12:30, my phone rang, and the screen displayed the number for the chief culture officer. I answered, and Chloe's voice came through, sounding panicked. She demanded that I provide the access codes for the gates because the drivers were blocking the entrance and the police had been called. I explained that I no longer had access to the servers and that sharing my credentials now would violate federal cybersecurity laws, exposing me to prosecution. She put Brandon on the line, and he threatened to sue me for corporate sabotage if I did not hand over the passwords immediately. I calmly told him that he had fired me because I was replaceable and suggested that his agile management team contact their corporate technology provider to reset the passwords, a process that usually took 36 hours and cost $3,500 in emergency fees. He screamed that he had 180 tons of temperature-sensitive soybeans sitting in Iowa that would spoil if the trucks did not move. I told him that agricultural commodities were indeed very delicate, and then I hung up on him. I sat back and watched the map fill with red, realizing that the empire was freezing solid, the drivers were standing firm, and the ports were closed to us. Brandon had the title, but I had the trust, and in logistics, trust is the only currency that matters. Looking out at the gray rain, I remembered my days in the desert, managing massive fuel convoys through territory where a single mistake meant a roadside bomb or an ambush. We did not have automated routing systems or culture directors telling us how to feel. We had our training, our trucks, and the unshakable bond between the soldiers in the lead vehicle and the mechanics in the rear. That was the kind of trust Brandon could never understand. He thought that because he had a high-speed database and a screen displaying metrics, he could treat 60-year-old drivers like line items on a balance sheet. He did not realize that when a driver is navigating a 90,000-pound rig through a freezing blizzard in the middle of Iowa, he does not care about synergy. He cares that the dispatcher on the other end of the line has his back, knows the local towing services, and has the authority to authorize an emergency repair on the spot. I was that dispatcher, and when Brandon cut me loose, he cut the lifeline. The feeling of hanging up on Brandon was incredibly satisfying, but I knew the crisis was only beginning. I received a text message from Clint Martinez, the foreman at the cold storage facility in Chicago. Clint told me that the refrigerated units were losing power because the company's automated fuel cards had been suspended due to the credit review triggered by Clause 7B. Clint asked if they should let the refrigerated cargo spoil. I texted him back, instructing him to connect the trucks to the facility's emergency shore power using the emergency account I had established 2 years prior. I told him to keep the cargo safe, but to make sure no trucks moved until a proper safety audit was completed. Clint agreed immediately, stating that the drivers were behind me and would not roll for Brandon. Meanwhile, I called Duncan Pierce, the vice president of Titan Transport, our largest competitor. Duncan had been trying to recruit me for years, but I had always declined out of loyalty to Donald. Now that loyalty was gone, replaced by a desire to protect the drivers and the network I had built. I met Duncan at a quiet coffee shop near the highway. I told him that I was a free agent and that I was willing to bring my entire vendor network, my driver relationships, and the cargo contracts to Titan Transport. I explained that I wanted full autonomy to run a new agricultural logistics division, reporting directly to him without any corporate interference. Duncan recognized the opportunity immediately and agreed, calling his legal department to draft the contracts. While we were discussing the details, a breaking news alert popped up on my phone. There had been a severe multi-truck accident on Interstate 80 involving an Ashford transport vehicle. The report indicated a hazardous materials spill and a complete shutdown of the interstate. I immediately called Bruce Gallagher to find out what had happened. Bruce confirmed that Brandon had tried to bypass the safety lockout. Desperate to move a critical shipment of industrial solvents, Brandon had used my old credentials to forge my electronic signature on the safety compliance documents, a direct violation of Illinois compiled statutes. Chapter 720, Act 5, Section 17.3. Since no union driver would accept the load, Brandon had hired an unqualified driver through a smartphone application. The driver did not possess a hazardous materials endorsement, which violated Title 49 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 383.23. The unqualified driver had taken a sharp curve too fast, causing the commercial vehicle to jackknife and spill hazardous materials across the highway. The Environmental Protection Agency was on the scene, and the driver had been rushed to the hospital with severe injuries. The situation was no longer a simple logistics delay. It was now a federal safety violation that would trigger a mandatory audit and a suspension of all Ashford transport operations under federal law. I looked at the coffee cup in front of me and knew that Brandon had just sealed the fate of his father's company. As I sat in the coffee shop, I watched the rain stream down the glass pane. I thought about the farmers who had trusted me with their grain and how close they had come to losing everything. It was their trust that had given me the leverage to negotiate with Duncan. In our business, you are only as good as the cargo you can deliver on time, and the cargo only moves if the people behind the wheel believe you have their safety in mind. The coffee shop was quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the espresso machine and the rain tapping against the glass. Duncan and I sat in a corner booth, looking over the logistics maps of the tri-state area. He knew as well as I did that the agricultural sector was the most demanding part of the business. You cannot delay a harvest shipment. Crops do not wait for corporate restructurings or software updates. If the grain sits in the silo for even 12 hours too long, it begins to ferment, destroying months of hard work for the farmers. Duncan looked at the contract drafts and nodded. He understood that by hiring me, he was not just bringing in an experienced manager, he was acquiring the loyalty of an entire network that had taken 3 decades to build. He signed the initial agreement and slid it across the table, welcoming me to the team. As we finalized the paperwork, the television screen hanging above the counter flickered with the breaking news report. The live helicopter footage showed a massive black skid mark stretching across all 3 lanes of Interstate 80, with a chemical tanker tilted on its side and white foam spraying from the emergency response vehicles. The reporter was talking about a major hazardous materials spill and an evacuation zone being established. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew that specific lane, and I knew that specific cargo. It was the industrial solvent load that Brandon had been pushing to clear all morning. He had bypassed every safety check in the database, using my electronic signature to authorize a driver who had never hauled chemical cargo before. In his haste to prove that he did not need me, he had created a disaster that would cost millions of dollars in environmental cleanup and damage claims, destroying whatever was left of Ashford Transport. The news of the accident sent shockwaves through the industry. The Department of Transportation immediately issued an emergency order grounding the entire Ashford Transport fleet. My phone rang again, and this time it was Roger Finch, the longtime corporate attorney for the Ashford family. Roger told me that Donald Ashford's private jet had just landed at the local airfield. Donald had heard about the stock price collapsing, but did not yet know the full extent of the highway disaster, and he was absolutely furious. Roger warned me that Donald was heading toward the terminal. I thanked Roger for the warning, walked out of the coffee shop, and drove my truck to the private airfield. I saw Donald's jet parked near the hangar, and Donald was walking down the steps, shouting into his phone. He looked around for his luxury sedan, but because Brandon had fired the dispatchers, there was no driver waiting for him. I rolled down my window and called out to him, telling him to get in. He looked at me in shock, then climbed into the passenger seat of my truck. As I drove him toward the headquarters, I explained the reality of the situation. I told him that his son had fired me over a culture fit issue, which had triggered Clause 7B and halted the entire fleet. I then explained that Brandon had forged my signature on the safety compliance documents to release the hazardous materials shipment, violating state forgery laws and federal motor carrier safety regulations. I told him about the jackknife truck on Interstate 80 and the impending Environmental Protection Agency fines. Donald sat in silence, his face pale as he processed the destruction of the company he had built over 5 decades. He looked at me and asked if I would return if he fired Brandon immediately and cleaned house. I looked at him and shook my head. I told him that the damage was too severe and that the federal government would soon suspend their operating authority permanently. However, I offered him an alternative. I proposed that Titan Transport would acquire the assets of Ashford Transport for the symbolic price of $1, and in exchange, Titan would assume all liabilities and protect the $12 million pension fund for our 250 union drivers. I explained that this was the only way to save the retirement funds of the men and women who had spent their lives working for him. Donald looked out the window at the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles in the distance, feeling the weight of the disaster. He nodded slowly and agreed to the deal. It was a painful moment for an old king, but he knew it was the only way to preserve some dignity. Donald turned his head to look at me. His eyes clouded with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. He asked me how it had come to this, how a son he had given everything to could be so blind to the realities of the business. I told him that Brandon had never had to earn the respect of a driver or negotiate a rate with a skeptical vendor. He had only known the boardroom, where success is measured in clean slides and bullet points rather than loaded trailers and safe miles. Donald nodded slowly, his fingers tapping against his knee in a rhythm I had seen 1,000 times during our early morning meetings in the old office. He realized that by shielding his son from the grind, he had left him completely unprepared to lead. As my truck cruised down the highway toward the terminal, Donald Ashford sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead at the rain-slicked road. The anger that had been radiating from him when he descended the steps of his private jet had slowly evaporated, replaced by a quiet, crushing realization. He began talking about the early days. Back in the late 1970s, when he started the company with just 2 second-hand trucks and a leased warehouse space near the Chicago docks. He remembered how we had worked 30-hour shifts during the winter storms, sleeping on the floor of the dispatch office to ensure that our deliveries arrived on time. He had built this company with sweat, calluses, and a reputation for keeping his word. Now, in the span of a single morning, his son had reduced that legacy to a federal investigation scene and a crashing stock price. We pulled into the parking lot of the corporate headquarters, which was blocked by police barriers and yellow caution tape. Environmental Protection Agency trucks were parked along the curb, and television crews were setting up their cameras in the rain. Donald looked at the chaos and let out a long sigh. He asked me if the deal with Titan Transport was really the only option left. I looked him in the eye and told him the truth. I explained that under federal safety regulations, the Department of Transportation would suspend their operating authority within 24 hours due to the forgery and the unqualified driver. The civil penalties from the chemical spill and the personal injury lawsuits would easily exceed the company's insurance limits, draining their bank accounts. Selling the assets to Titan Transport for $1 was the only way to save the $12 million pension fund and ensure that the drivers who had stood by him for decades would not lose their retirement security. The acquisition was finalized the following morning. Titan Transport took control of the Ashford assets, and we immediately integrated the drivers and contracts into our new strategic agricultural division. The $12 million pension fund was successfully transferred, ensuring that every driver's retirement was fully protected. The transition was seamless because the drivers trusted me, and they were back on the road within 48 hours under Titan's operating authority. Brandon Ashford was arrested and charged under Illinois compiled statutes, Chapter 720, Act 5, Section 17(3) for forgery, as well as federal safety violations under Title 49 of the United States Code Section 5123. He eventually received an 18-month sentence in a federal correctional facility. Chloe Bennett's consulting contract was terminated, and her podcast about corporate culture disappeared after a few weeks. Donald Ashford returned to Arizona permanently, sending me a case of vintage wine with a short note thanking me for saving the pensions of his former employees. 6 months after the transition, our new division at Titan Transport was performing exceptionally well, with fleet utilization increasing by 32% and 0 safety incidents. I was sitting in my new office, which looked out over the busy port, when my assistant Quincy walked in with the morning reports. Quincy told me that we had a critical shipment of wheat in Nebraska that needed to be moved before an early frost, requiring 220 trucks by dawn. I put on my headset, opened the routing software, and began coordinating the drivers. That evening, I drove home to my apartment, where my son Toby was waiting for me. Toby had just graduated from his welding program at the trade school with honors. He told me that his instructors had been discussing the Ashford transition in their logistics classes, calling it a masterclass in operational control. He told me that I was a legend among the working guys. I laughed and told him that I was no legend, just a man who understood how systems worked and respected the people who kept them running. I looked at my son, who had grease under his fingernails and pride in his eyes, and felt a deep sense of accomplishment. I realized that the real strength of our country does not reside in corporate boardrooms or in the hands of arrogant executives with fancy degrees. It belongs to the drivers, the mechanics, the dispatchers, and the working people who show up every day to do the hard work. When the people in power forget that, they learn the hard way, that a system cannot function without the trust of those who keep it moving. That is the lesson of Ashford Transport, and it is a lesson that will endure long after the corporate buildings are gone. I took a sip of my coffee, looked at the photos of my old Army unit on the wall, and felt ready for the next shipment. The courtroom was nearly empty on the day of the sentencing, a stark contrast to the busy press conferences Brandon had staged when he first took over the company. His high-priced lawyers tried to argue that it was a technical system error, but the digital audit trail was clear and indisputable. The judge was a no-nonsense woman who had spent years in the federal system, and she made it clear that corporate executives would be held to the same standards of law as the drivers on the highway. When she handed down the 18-month sentence, Brandis looked smaller than he ever had, his designer suit suddenly looking like a costume. As they led him away, I felt no anger, only a deep sense of relief that the drivers' futures were finally secure. The transition of the operating assets was completed with remarkable speed, thanks to the cooperation of the union and the port authorities. The drivers knew that their pensions were secure under Titan Transport, and they showed up for their shifts with a renewed sense of purpose. We did not lose a single major client during the transition. Instead, companies like Allied Agricultural and the Midwest grain haulers actually increased their contract volumes because they knew that the operations were still being managed by the same team they had trusted for decades. Looking out at the harbor now, watching the container ships being loaded under the bright afternoon sun, I feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. My new office is clean and spacious, but it still smells of dark coffee, and the radio on my desk still crackles with the voices of drivers calling in from the road. Toby's graduation was a proud moment for both of us. He is working at a fabrication shop now, earning his own way and learning the value of hard work. He looks at me and sees a father who stood up for his people, and I look at him and see a young man who will carry that legacy forward. The working guys are the ones who keep the wheels turning, and as long as we stand together and respect the trust between us, no amount of corporate arrogance can ever tear us down.